Good afternoon. This is Dr. G. This week we're going to begin a discussion of gender. This is part of a two-week module that we will be focusing in on gender and gender identity. So just to review real quickly, we've talked a whole lot about stereotypes, and this is a word you will hear used quite frequently throughout this unit or throughout this module. And we want to just be reminded that stereotypes are commonly held beliefs or assumptions about groups or types of people, and stereotypes can be based on race, class, religion, ethnicity, age, and today we're going to focus on the stereotype of gender. So let's first do some basic definitions of the difference between sex and gender, and we will use these definitions throughout the next 2 weeks. The first is, let's define what we mean when we refer to the idea of sex. And this is the biological difference, that difference that is decided based on our chromosomes, the hormonal differences that we have, our internal and external parts, specifically our sex organs. That's what is, when we talk about sex, that's what we're referring to in general, again, based on that biological or chromosomal difference in a person's makeup. That actually is what determines sex. When we're speaking about gender, this is a very cultural delineated idea, and it describes, based on our culture or our society, our feminine characteristics or our masculine characteristics. So when we are speaking of a man, in general terms, for the majority of us, we're thinking of someone that identifies as male, as their sex. So biologically, they're predetermined to be a male and have the male sexual organs. And in general, when we combine that with that idea of gender, we're also seeing a man as having specific social roles based upon what is defined in our culture or society as being masculine or manly. When we're thinking of a woman, we're for the majority of us, we consider that sex being identified by the chromosomes or the biological circumstances of being a woman. And then the cultural impacts of being a woman come from what society identifies as a woman's role or specific characteristics. So again, sex is what is predetermined by our chromosomes, and then we have our gender is actually more of what is based on what our society or culture defines as appropriate behaviors for our particular sex. And gender bias refers to our prejudice or preference over one gender over the other, and we could also, in this case, also put in the word sex, our bias against one sex or a preference for one sex over the other, and we're going to get more into the sexual preference piece in the second week of this module. Our gender bias for most of us is very unconscious. However, there are times when there are very conscious biases made. And oftentimes these gender biases can be very blatant, very obvious, or they can be very subtle. So let's just talk a little bit about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman in our society today. Our identities are formed by both environment and the biological factors that come into play. And it's important for us to understand how these different identities do affect us overall, but both in schools as students and as teachers. As our children or our students enter the classroom with cultural information in those invisible knapsacks, they arrive. We've talked about with a racial identity, with a class identity, and they're also going to arrive with a gender identity, and that affects the way that their peers and their perceive them. It affects their own talents and abilities, and even their roles in schools. Um, and unfortunately, we see that oftentimes schools do reinforce these identities, and they reinforce these identities based on um, school rules and different school activities, and even the teacher and the teacher's interactions with them. As early as birth, we learn to pay attention to gender. Actually, even before a child is born now, we can know a child's gender, and plans are made. Clothes that are bought in certain color schemes, the way a nursery is designed, is dependent on a gender of gender identification of the child. So that's one of the first things that we often ask newly expecting parents is, is it a boy or girl? We want to know, and that does impact how we will interact with the child. We often find children's literature to be full of ideas about gender. They have very gender specific messages. When you look at most of the traditional folk and fairy tales, there's some uh, conscious, subtle, and not so subtle references to gender appropriate behaviors. If you consider the story of Little Red Riding Hood, where the little girl is frightened by the big male wolf who's eaten her grandmother, the little girl is seen as very feminine and obedient and naive, and then we have the big vicious um, male wolf who eats this little helpless grandmother. Um, and this is something that we need to be mindful of in any story or literature that we use with students. And oftentimes these stories and literature do come from specific cultural backgrounds that do have specific gender roles that they identify with. Um, so as Sadker identified about 12 years ago, sitting in a classroom, females and males may get different messages from what is being taught by the teacher. Um, there's going to be discrepancies in oftentimes in what is taught and how it's taught, and that does oftentimes result in differences between the performances of boys and girls within within schools. The socialization of gender within our schools oftentimes does, excuse me, let's go back, oftentimes does assure that our girls are made aware of the fact that they aren't unequal to the boys. Anytime students are seated or lined up by gender, our teachers are affirming that boys and girls should be treated differently. When an administrator ignores an act of sexual harassment, then he or she could be disallowing the degradation, or could be allowing the degradation of girls. When different behaviors are tolerated for boys and for girls, because boys will be boys, schools are perpetuating this idea of females being less worthy of respect, or perhaps of female oppression. And there is some evidence that teachers will oftentimes socialize girls towards a real feminine idea, that girls are the ones that are praised for, and this idea of positive behavior support, girls are praised for being neat and quiet and calm, and yet we are encouraging boys to speak up and think independently and be active. Girls tend to be socialized in schools to recognize popularity as being important, and they learn that educational performance and ability aren't perhaps quite as important. And we are seeing some of the results of that when we look in our fields of science and technology and engineering and math, where the girls are not becoming parts of that field, and there feels definitely where we are seeing fewer and fewer, or we're seeing fewer girls in general join, and we're trying to there's a big switch now in the field of education to encourage our girls to become more active in these areas of STEM, or science, technology, and math. So clearly the socialization of gender is reinforced in our schools. We have, if you think about our classrooms, they are just really microcosms of our society. They tend to our classrooms follow those normal socialization patterns of young children that sometimes lead to these distorted perceptions of gender and gender role. And this type of gender bias is becoming part of what is the hidden curriculum. You probably have heard this term before. The hidden curriculum that is found within our schools, where our students are taught through the everyday functioning of the classroom that one group is more important or less important than another, and this can be embedded in socialization patterns, in our textbooks, in lessons, and in our teacher interactions with students. There has been a lot of research done on teacher interactions with the different genders. It's been found that in general, teachers will prefer to interact with the male students, and that male students are given more opportunities to answer questions that involve deeper levels of thinking. Gender bias can also be taught or be hidden through the resources that are chosen for classroom use. So for example, we mentioned the use of the text or the literature there, but when you're looking at texts and things that you are going to be using with students, you may find that many times the contributions of women have been omitted or stereotyped. So we need to look for more gender balanced materials to use with our students. Another piece of this hidden curriculum is also or can also be found in evaluation of student work. And the Sadkers did some research in that area. We do need to recognize that gender bias is a very relevant issue or problem within our school settings, and that we need to make sure that we are aware of it and that we also do whatever we can as teachers to not be silent and passive about this and be willing to make noise about unfair treatment that we see our students perhaps receiving based on their gender. Part of that is us becoming more aware of our own biased teaching behaviors. So as we are thinking about working within our schools, some of the things that we can consider doing as teachers is to make sure that we establish a gender equitable curriculum, that we provide gender fair materials, and that there is affirmation of all genders within the materials that we use. That we make sure that we avoid stereotyping jobs within our classrooms, that we provide boys and girls with the same opportunities for jobs. We provide boys and girls with the same opportunities for participation in activities and within coursework. And again, I mentioned the STEM initiatives that are making it a push toward getting more girls and involved in the areas of science, technology, and math and engineering. That we try not to segregate groups, and I know there is some debate on whether or not certain classes should be segregated. There have been some research done in the areas of math and science that found that girls actually perform better if they're in a class of all females, but we need to look at the segregation that we do within groups and within courses very carefully. And that we are trying to put both boys and girls in positions that are non-traditional, and switching those roles up. So as you move through this particular module, you're really going to be looking at your own gender and your own possible gender biases and doing some perspective taking. You'll be reading an article on the history of sexism in the United States, and then you'll be exploring gender bias from both a female perspective and the male perspective, looking at how media impacts our ideas of gender bias, which is huge in our culture, is the impact that media plays on this. So again, this is part of a 2-week module. Next week we'll move into another phase of this, and I hope that as you unpack your own knapsack that you discover and learn more about yourself.